Wine Stories, a podcast to discover the world of wine by Étienne Pommier.
Our story begins in the spring of 1951 in Burgundy, in the heart of the famous Côte d'Or. The quiet and rural life of the tiny village of Vosne has always been bound to the seasonal cycles of the vineyards, rhythmed by the bell of St. Martin's Church ringing every hour. But for a few weeks now, disturbing noises have been troubling the calm and hard-working life of the Pearl of the Côte, a term coined by historian Gaston Roupnel in 1936. Boom, boom, boom. On the slope above the village, covered with vineyards so famous that the inhabitants decided to change its name to Vosne-Romanée in 1866, a couple of silhouettes have been working for months in a parcel just below the forest, above the Grand Cru Ridgeberg. Boom, boom, boom. Several times a day, the sound of powerful explosions ripping the stone apart to plant new vines can be heard from a distance. This plot hasn't been planted since the phylloxera outbreak, abandoned by major landowners who considered that the quality of the wine that could come out of this harsh and rocky terrain isn't worth the necessary efforts to cultivate it. In this fallow land, close to the forest where cows used to graze, a carter working for Domaine Camuset had planted Jerusalem artichokes during the war to help feed the family. But last year, a young vintner who couldn't take over the family estate destined to his elder brother showed up at the notary's office to buy a part of this 1 hectare plot. Expecting harsh competition to get his hands on this land, he was surprised to realize that no one else was interested. And after a whole winter spent with his wife Marcel digging up with a pickaxe tons of rocks piling up in a new stone wall, he is now ripping the bedrock with TNT to make holes for new plantings. 400 sticks of dynamite later, the vineyard is now ready and the people of Vosne-Romanée will soon have peace again. The plants have been carefully chosen through massal selections from old mother vines in order to produce here a wine of terroir with a strong sense of place. This young vigneron's name is Henri and the plot he's just spent months preparing for planting is the Cros Parantoux. He was born on February 6, 1922, in Vosne-Romanée, in a winemaking family, but rather dreamed of becoming an aviator someday. He did work for a negociant when he was 16 years old, but while he wanted to continue his studies, his father Eugene called him back at the domain to replace his 2 elder brothers mobilized at the beginning of World War II. It's a friend of the family, René Angel, who would convince him and his father to pursue enological studies, arguing that it will only take 1 day a week for 1 year to complete the training. His father accepts, and the young Henri starts attending classes to obtain, in 1942, the first enology diploma from the Dijon faculty that will be converted into a national degree in enology in 1956. Under the mentorship of René Angel, one of the leading lights in Burgundy at the time, Henri learns how to tend a vineyard and make wine, and by the end of the war, he is now ready to take over the family estate. However, according to the family rules back then, the management of the estate will be transferred to his elder brother Lucien. His other brother George, looking into a career in forestry, will ask Henri to tend his own vineyards, which will give birth to an Échezeaux Grand Cru and a Nuit Saint-Georges under the George and Henri Jaillet label. With an inheritance of 3 hectares of vineyards, including holdings in the Échezeaux Grand Cru and the Beaumont Premier Cru, Henri starts his own domain, vinifying his first vintage on his own in 1945. Thanks to a referral from his mentor René Angel, he acquires from Maria Noiro-Camuset a second piece of the Cros Parantoux and becomes the tenant farmer of a few rows of Ridgeberg and other vines in Vosne-Romanée and Nuit Saint-Georges. Now owner of 0.72 hectares of the Cros Parantoux, he obtains the right to cultivate the remaining 0.3 hectares of fallow land still in the hands of Mrs. Noiro-Camuset. She dies in 1959 with no children, and the estate goes to her nephew Jean Méot, an engineer become politician, now advisor to French President General de Gaulle. Méot confirms the sharecropping agreement, and from now on, Henri Jaillet is the sole bottler of Vosne-Romanée Premier Cru, Cros Parantoux. The plot already appears on the land registry of Vosne in 1827, and in his 1855 classification, Dr. Laval ranks it as a third cuvée, same as Les Petits Monts. Camille Rodier also mentions it in his 1920 opus, but it is the hard work and dedication of Henri Jaillet that will truly put it on the map and make it what it is today. In the early years of the domain, Henri Jaillet sells everything to negociants in France and Belgium. In those days, Burgundy is ruled by negociants who have the financial means to buy the wines and the distribution networks to sell them. They run the market and impose their views and prices onto the small producers. Henri Jaillet himself took as an example the fine 1959 vintage that sold cheap because the crop was abundant. Bottling at the estate is still rare back then, and only a handful of merchants buy direct estate bottled wines, such as US-based importers Frank Schoonmaker at Domaine Ramonet Prud'hon or Frederick Wildman with Armand Rousseau. Quality wines are still too cheap for vignerons to earn a decent living, and encouraged by traders who favor price over quality, many producers embrace the modern approach, productivity. They start applying the new agricultural methods promoted back then, such as the intense use of chemical inputs in the vineyards, including pesticides and fertilizers, as well as enological products such as commercial yeasts, bacteria, and nutrients in the winery. New, more productive clones are being planted, and the character of the wines fades as the yields increase. In the 1970s, the quality of wines in many French regions, including Burgundy, has decreased. Only a handful of vignerons keep fighting to preserve traditional methods and refuse modern viticultural and enological practices. Henri Jaillet is one of them. He tells to anyone who would listen that beyond 40 hectoliters per hectare, the sense of terroir in the wine disappears, and that ancient pre-phylloxeric vineyards planted at much higher densities of up to 50,000 vines per hectare barely gave 20 hectoliters of wines. Vines excessively nurtured with fertilizers only develop surface roots and have stopped digging for nutrients in the subsoil, so the berries lose concentration and character. Too much potassium has diluted wines, now lacking flesh and structure, forcing enologists to intervene and chaptalize. Voices such as Jules Chauvet speak up against the misguided practices of productivism, until things start changing in the 1980s, thanks to the emergence of organic and biodynamic farming. In the meantime, Henri Jaillet has stopped selling to negociants to start distributing direct in 1976, and the trajectory of the domain will soon change after a tasting in California. With the 1978 vintage, Henri Jaillet exports his first wines to the United States with his importer Martin Saunier, who will first introduce them in a tasting in Los Angeles. The success is instantaneous, especially since 1978 is the best vintage Jaillet has ever vinified, according to the master himself. It's hard not to be jealous when you think of the merchants and journalists who received samples of the Jaillet Richebourg and Cros Parantoux in 1978. From this moment on, the word spreads and Henri Jaillet wines become very famous in the US and in England. At the same time, the vigneron is still perceived in his home country as a not-so-interesting old-timer by famous French critics, some of whom are still active and famous today. But what makes Jaillet wine so special? As all top vignerons would say, wine is made in the vineyard. And for Jaillet, it starts with hard, tedious and relentless work in the vineyard, learned with his mentors. It is pruning at 5 a.m, or ploughing the rows with his first horse pilot all day long, only stopping for a snack until nightfall. It is manual, hard work and long days up to 15 hours sometimes. I also want to pay homage to the dedication and commitment of his wife Marcelle, who met him before the war and shared his life and his work, which was the same. Not only did she take care of the house and kids, but she also was with him in the vineyards all year long and was instrumental in the quality of the viticulture and the wines at the domain. Henri Jaillet wasn't against progress, and he was one of the first vintners to buy a lightweight tractor to replace his horse, but he tirelessly refused to follow the mainstream trend at the time, seeking productivity, thanks to maximum mechanization and use of systemic products. Throughout all those years, he only ever trusted his own observations and common sense. He preferred massal selections of what he used to call Pinot tordu or twisted Pinot, by contrast with clones of straight Pinot sold in those days, easier to grow and tend but lesser in terms of wine quality. I already talked about clones in the Season 1 episode about old vines, and if you're not familiar with the concept, I invite you to listen to it. In his book about Henri Jaillet, French author Jackie Rigaud reminds the opinion of the vigneron on clones. Be careful with clones. You're under risk of having only a quarter of dry extract with 3/4 of juice in the berries, when quality plants from massal selections contain 1/3 of dry extract and 2/3 of liquid. True Pinot is 1 gram per berry, 125 berries per bunch, 125 grams in total. This pulp-to-juice ratio is the basis of what is commonly referred to as concentration of the berries, and it explains why Jaillet wines often taste more intense and profound than some of his colleagues. For not only did he obtain berries with a higher concentration in sugars and phenolics, they also had higher levels of acid compared to fruit coming from heavily treated and fertilized vines. And it was that very combination of a rich core of fruit with a fresh acid that gave his wines a captivating aromatic profile, remarkably silky mouthfeel, and astonishing vibrancy. In the winery, his philosophy can be summed up quite simply: respect the fruit. He systematically rejected the use of whole bunches that would give green flavors and raspy tannins. Having realized that in the cooler years the wine would typically have more profound color and aromas, he was one of the first winemakers to practice cold soaking for 5 to 6 days before fermentation for a smoother extraction of phenolic compounds. Vinification typically lasted 15 to 18 days, using only indigenous yeasts before the wines were racked into barrels. His barrels, Henri Jaillet wanted them exclusively made of premium oak from the Tronchet forest and dried for exactly 2 years. When barrel maker John François would deliver him his annual order, he would smell every single one of them as they were unloading the truck to make sure the quality was up to his standards. He only chose new barrels for all appellations and asked for a medium toast that wouldn't give too much flavor or tannins to the wines. While the use of new oak can easily overpower a thin wine, Jaillet's bottlings were so intense that they could easily digest a long 18-month maturing in 100% new French oak without losing their balance or finesse. Finally, he wanted to touch the wine as little as possible to preserve all the potential acquired in the vineyard, and systematically refused any kind of filtration, even if it must be said here that the techniques back in the day were much more rudimentary and impactful than current methods. The wines were bottled 1 barrel at a time, by hand, with a typical Burgundian tool called a goat. The goat, or chèvre in French, is a tap with 2 nozzles, allowing the producer to fill 1 bottle with one hand while grabbing the next empty bottle to be filled with the other one. With this system, you need about 2 hours to bottle 1 barrel, so about 4 barrels a day. Overall, it would take Marcel and Henri Jaillet about 3 weeks per year to do 25,000 bottles, when a bottling line would have done it in just a few hours. This method allows a very smooth bottling without shaking or moving the wine, which is essential for quality and clarity, especially when the wine is unfiltered. But the downside is that you may have quality variations between the top and the bottom of the barrel and from one barrel to another, even though Henri Jaillet always asserted that every single bottle of each wine was consistent. Some winemakers, like Jean-François Coche-Dury, have perpetuated this tradition, but most producers today prefer to blend all the different barrels of the same cru to ensure an homogeneous bottling. Henri Jaillet's tapestry was the terroir of Vosne-Romanée, where he owned the majority of his 6 hectares. Vosne, the pearl of the Côte, set between Nuits Saint-Georges and Vougeot on the slope formed millions of years ago by the collapse of the Saône's alluvial plain. The vineyards of Vosne sit on brown calcareous soils covered with a layer of silt, clay and scree only about 10 centimeters thick at the top of the gradient and 1 meter thick at its bottom. The composition of the cover soil depends on the altitude and position on this slope fractured by dozens of transverse cracks. Geologists say that there are fault lines of 100 meters every kilometer, of 10 meters every 100 meters, and of 1 meter every 10 meters. Hence, the mosaic of climats and appellations in Burgundy. Beyond a few vines in AOC-Bourgogne and in Nuits Saint-Georges, including a piece of the Premier Cru Les Meugets, Henri Jaillet worked Les Saules, Les Barreaux and Les Vigneux in Vosne-Romanée village, Les Beaumonts, Haut-Brûlé and Cros Parantoux in Premier Cru, as well as plots in the Échezeaux Grand Cru, namely Les Cruaux and Les Treux, and in the Grand Cru Richebourg, in Les Verroils and Les Richebourg. If you ever visit Vosne-Romanée, you can easily see, without going into the vineyards of course, the Richebourg and above it the Cros Parantoux, with the wall of stones excavated in the 1950s, and just below it, on the north side, the Premier Cru Haut-Brûlé. Located at the entrance of the Combe, the Cros Parantoux is slightly more sheltered and less exposed than the Richebourg, with a rockier terroir, which gives a slightly fresher, more vertical and mineral profile compared to the Grand Cru. Being located 1 to 2 meters below the Cros Parantoux, Les Brûlés, on the other hand, proposes a rounder and more opulent expression of Vosne. The tenant farming agreement with Méo-Camusé for the Cros Parantoux and the Richebourg ended in the 80s, and Henri Jaillet shared the crop of the 85 and 86 vintages before making his last Richebourg in 1987. However, he remained involved in the domain until the early 1990s and trained Jean-Nicolas Méo, who runs the family estate today. The father of 2 daughters who decided to pursue their careers outside of the wine industry, Henri Jaillet started passing his vineyards on to his nephew Emmanuel Rouget in 1989, who also took over those of brothers Lucien and George. Henri Jaillet retired in 1996, and he only kept 3 barrels of Cros Parantoux since that was the maximum allowed by the French pension administration. His last vintage was 2001, and from 2002 onwards, the only 2 Cros Parantoux being labelled have come from Emmanuel Rouget and Méo-Camusé. Henri Jaillet was 84 years old when he passed away on Wednesday the 20th of December 2006 in Vosne-Romanée. And his wife Marcelle died at the age of 92 on December the 12th, 2013. A respected, then revered figure while he was still alive, Henri Jayer has become a true legend of Burgundy wine since his demise. For example, he is depicted as the god of Burgundy in the Japanese manga Tears of God by Tadashi Agi and Shu Okimoto. French author and wine lover Bernard Pivot even wrote a crime novel published in 1986 where a collector, frustrated to be so far behind on the domain's waiting list, starts killing people ahead of him to be able to buy Jayer wine sooner. The last page of the domain story was written on June 17, 2018, when Henri Jayer's daughters sold the last bottles of the family cellar. Nowadays, Jayer wines have almost disappeared, and I can only advise you to be extremely cautious about the way too many bottles that keep popping up in sales and auctions nowadays. As an authentication expert, I've inspected dozens of Jayer bottles over the last decade, and only a handful of them were genuine. Henri Jayer's legacy is first and foremost the vision and passion that he passed on to the new generation of winemakers who used to come to him for help and advice on viticulture or winemaking. Emmanuel Rougier, of course, but also Jean-Nicolas Méot, Philippe Charlopin or Christophe Roumier in Burgundy, Didier Dagueneau or Bernard Foucault in the Loire Valley, and the likes of Ted Lemon and David Ramey in California, amongst others. Each one of them, in his own way, gives us a taste of the vision and philosophy of Henri Jayer, perhaps the most inspirational wine figure of the 20th century.